So a surprisingly complex little task here as it relates to making sure that the content on one server exists correctly on another server, as well as layering over the top the DFS namespaces piece that allows you to ensure users get directed to the right server depending on where they may be. So what have we talked about in this module? We have talked about both halves of DFS, starting with DFS namespaces in its most simplest implementation. We talked about how DFS namespaces is kind of an aggregator of links to provide you a location to kind of abstract or virtualize the different servers and shares that exist in your environment. From there, we switched over into DFSR and talked about the configuration of DFS replication targets. We did some tuning of the replication scheduling, talked a bit about remote differential compression settings, and also talked about that staging folder and how the configuration of that staging folder can impact the transfer of very large files. From there, we switched back to DFSN to talk about with a then replicated environment across multiple servers, potentially across multiple sites, it becomes possible to use DFSN to create a fault-tolerant configuration for users to access their data. And then from there, switched into these three new topics here for Windows Server 2012 R2 that deal with cloning our DFS database, recovering that database, ostensibly using cloning, also recovering individual files and folders if they should experience a conflict as replication goes about doing its everyday activities. And then concluded with a look at optimizing DFS replication and how you can tune the size of your staging folder to perhaps better improve the transfer of data as it moves from one server to another. Coming up next, we're going to kind of lay on top of our existing file server infrastructure, even including some of the DFS components, an additional solution called FSRM, or the File Services Resource Manager. With FSRM, we gain a lot of control over just getting a look or peeking into the actual files and folders that exist on those shares. With FSRM, we can configure things like quotas, or essentially limiting people to a certain amount of disk space. We can configure file screens to identify the bad data that we don't want replicated around our environments. We can configure reports so we know what's on those machines. And then lastly, we can configure some file management tasks to perform things based off of file characteristics. FSRM, as I'd mentioned before, is one of those unsung heroes in the file server space because you don't see it implemented all that often, even considering how powerful it can be. That conversation on FSRM is the topic for our next module coming up.